Hi everyone, I want to talk about Season 1, in particular how it may or may not change our builds. Now this is before the patch notes. We don't know if they're actually going to show us all the new stuff in the patch notes or if you can data mine it at all, but you might have seen that in Season 1 we're going to get those Malignant Hearts. So here's a screenshot from the live stream where they previewed those. You can socket them into your jewelry, so the rings and amulets. You see they have like different colored sockets. These are like some special new sockets that are used for those Season 1 only drops. Now recently we got some new teasers about this, which is from the official Twitter from Diablo, and there they showed that these hearts have 4 different colors. There's the Vicious Heart, which has offensive powers, Brutal for defensive, Devious utility, and the Wrathful has super powers, whatever that means. So we don't know exactly how the system will work, but you're going to have these different colors, and when you defeat those seasonal monsters, you can find these different types of hearts, and you can also salvage them and craft new ones. So there's like this new NPC in the season, and he is basically the vendor and crafter of these things, so you can kind of convert them back and forth. And apparently the jeweler in the game will also allow you to change the colors of these sockets so that you can always like run the ones you have. So maybe you can actually stack the same type, and maybe you can actually make all of them these Wrathful ones, which may be like a stronger version that are just generally on a better tier than the others, but maybe harder to get. But in the end, you can see that there is a bit of like a balance between those. So you see one of these examples here of a Wrathful heart. So there's like the super powers, and you can see here that this has like an effect where it cycles through different bonuses every 20 kills. So you always have one of them active, and they can be relatively impactful here. 22% attack speed, 70% chance to fully restore the primary resource on the core or basic skill use, and something like, yeah, you gain a barrier here and there. So of course, this depends a bit on how much it scales, but I can see some of those effects seem to be quite powerful, and it has multiple levels. So it says like level 2, and I guess it can go even higher than that because it's like a very low item power thing. So maybe you can get something like 30% attack speed or 40% or something like that. So they can actually turn out to be really crazy, and you get 3 of them. Generally, what those things mean is that it's going to be some relatively massive power creep in this first season. So if you have played the vanilla version, basically the Eternal Realm now from launch until now you're going to be a lot more powerful. So as I said, you know, this is like a level 2 really low item power thing that can probably go way higher, and you can see how powerful some of these effects can be. Now imagine you can stack up 3 effects that are on the power level of something like 20 to 30% attack speed. So it's basically an offensive legendary power like the accelerating power, right? So we have this here, for example. It's basically exactly that, but it's just a gem. So this actually adds a lot of extra power, and we already have very, very powerful builds in this game. And we already have very powerful builds in this game right now that can basically decimate Uber Lilith in like a minute, that can clear tier 100 monsters, no problem. To be fair, a lot of those very powerful builds are also based on bugs or enabled by bugs, so there's that, I guess. But they are also just like valid, good builds that can do that, or at least close to it. And well, if you suddenly have something like double the DPS or so, that's gonna look real funny. So I'm wondering if Blizzard will actually start adding extra monster power of some sort, like they scale up with more HP or something, so they could probably do some kind of like scaling modifier across the board that just like makes them more powerful on the higher levels or so. But there's no mention of that. We'll see. But what it will mean is that generally you're going to be a lot stronger, a lot faster, so you can also maybe change your settings a little bit to be greedier when it comes to movement speed and cooldown for your mobility skills and these kind of things. But what it also means is that because you are so much more powerful, you're also most likely going to end up in higher Nightmare Dungeon tiers because you have so much damage. Of course, it makes no sense to farm low tier monsters when you could go higher tiers at the same pace, because you can still get a little bit more XP at the very least. And in that case, you're going to end up relatively squishy probably. So that's another problem, because not only do you go to higher tiers because you're stronger, but you also lose 750 armor. And well, 750 armor is actually quite significant. So I'm pretty doubtful that we're going to get just like raw armor, like, you know, like the skulls basically, as any of those options. I mean, it does say there are defensive hearts, but who knows what exactly they do. But if you know how damage reduction works, especially armor is very important. It's like your most important defensive tool, basically. You want to stack that to the cap, which is 85% damage reduction. And that is relatively hard to achieve, especially if you start taking off these skulls here. You see, I get from 66% damage reduction to 54% damage reduction. And that becomes even worse when you go even further away from the cap. So as a rogue, I have quite a lot. This is a pushing setup that I made here. So I have a lot of armor by default, just standing here. As you can see, I still have 6.8k. But it's not so easy for something like sorcerers, for necromancers, etc. They don't really have that much access to this armor. And now you may think, oh, this is just like minus 12% on a damage reduction. Well, this 12% actually does increase my damage taken by like a third or something like that. And those differences with your armor damage reduction become actually quite extreme on the higher levels. So when you get pretty close to the cap, when you're at 85% damage reduction, and then you take off your skulls and you go from 85 to, I don't know, maybe 75, that's almost double the damage taken for physical attacks. And, well, half of that armor is also applied to elemental attacks. This is a point that we also discussed in a lot of detail lately in our podcast. Especially Crip was bringing it up a few times, and, well, he has a point. This is really gonna hurt. This is like the minus 750 armor season, and I think this will be very noticeable for some builds, for some classes in particular. So it will come down a little bit to how strong are those defensive powers, and if you can stack multiple of them. So let's say they are somewhere on the power level of 20% damage reduction, like across the board or something, and you can stack them 3 times. That would kind of make up for the loss of those skulls, and more, I guess, because it also applies to elemental, etc. So you can probably become relatively tanky. And I imagine that, at least on the higher levels, when you have really good options available to you, this might be better. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't use the new hearts because the skulls are so important or so. It's more like you have to be aware that your armor scaling is going to be very different in Season 1, and this will result in a very different feeling with the toughness of your character in particular. Survivability is basically the only limiting factor when it comes to playing this game for the most part. So as long as you have some kind of working build, you can kind of work your way through any kind of content. You know, even tier 100 nightmare dungeons, it's all about surviving and almost not at all about anything else. So in that case, being squishier, not reaching the armor cap so easily, and then having massively more damage taken due to the armor damage formula is gonna feel pretty bad, unless those defensive options are really powerful. And on top of this, I low-key expect a nerf for the disobedience aspect, which is the best defensive aspect in the game by a mile. It's not even close, basically. For any of the classes, you want to have this aspect for basically every single build, and especially if you can stack this easily with like dots and multi-hits and these kind of effects, it just gives you a ton more damage reduction than anything else ever could. And if that happens together with the skull removal for the season, then we're gonna have a pretty fun time, I guess. But we'll see. In the end, it's still a bit of speculation, so we have to wait a few more days to find out what actually happens. But at least for the Theorycrafting crowd that wants to prepare for the season, this is definitely something to keep in mind here. Now, there are some ways to mitigate this, like the Iron Skin Elixir. So because you have so much more offense than this season, you don't really need to run something like a Cruelty, for example, for extra damage. Instead, you just run a defensive one. But this is also a drop-only elixir. You mostly get to some health tide, and quite rarely so. So it's not really the most viable strategy to rely on this to fix your armor problems. In any case, it's just my 2 cents on the system so far. So I think that probably a lot of the really cool powers are gonna be the offensive ones, the ones that have like some procs and, you know, some cool new stuff. You see this here, for example, where you have like this electric charge and then the pulses or something like that. And yeah, I do like that idea, but realistically, I think we're gonna stack the defense wherever we can, because most builds are already kind of powerful, at least in build right, and we're probably gonna see a lot of buffs to some of the weaker builds anyway, and you have to make up for the loss of these skulls somehow. So let's see how it goes. And that's it for now. I'm gonna keep you guys updated with what we learn. Hope you liked this one, and see you guys next time.